A woman living 12,000 years ago menstruated maybe 50 times in her entire life. You, statistically, will menstruate around 450 times.
That's not a typo. That's one of the strangest, least discussed shifts in human biology, and almost nobody talks about why it happened. Let's go.
Think about that number for a second. 50 versus 450. That's not a small gap. That's not a rounding error. That's a 9-fold difference between you and a woman who lived, biologically speaking, an evolutionary blink of an eye ago. Same species, same reproductive hardware, same hormones. And yet her body experienced a completely different relationship with menstruation than yours does. Something happened between then and now. Something huge. And it's not what most people assume. Here's the thing that sounds like it should be obvious, but somehow never gets said out loud in any documentary about prehistoric life. Ancient women did not spend their lives constantly bleeding, constantly managing periods, constantly dealing with the exact monthly cycle you experience today. Their bodies were doing something fundamentally different. And once you understand why, you start to see prehistoric life, and honestly your own body, in a completely different light. Let's start with the biology, because the biology is where this whole story actually begins. Menstruation, from an evolutionary standpoint, is expensive, genuinely expensive. Every cycle costs the body iron, costs it calories, costs it a rebuilding of uterine tissue from scratch. In a world of chronic caloric scarcity, a body that menstruates 450 times over a lifetime is a body spending an enormous amount of its limited energy budget on something that isn't directly keeping it alive. Evolution does not tend to keep expensive processes running at full throttle unless something is actively suppressing them. And in the ancestral environment, something was. That something has a name. Researchers studying reproductive ecology call it lactational amenorrhea. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most underappreciated forces in human evolutionary history. Breastfeeding, when it's frequent, when it's on demand, when a baby is nursing multiple times an hour around the clock the way infants do, without bottles or formula or scheduled feedings, suppresses ovulation. Not perfectly, not with 100% reliability, but powerfully. And ancient women were breastfeeding almost constantly. Anthropologist Beverly Strassman, who spent years studying menstruation among the Dogon people of Mali, one of the few populations still living close to a traditional subsistence lifestyle, found something that completely upended the modern assumption. Dogon women experience roughly 100 menstrual cycles in their lifetime. Modern Western women experience closer to 350 to 400. That's not a small cultural difference. That's an entirely different biological experience of being a woman. Now, stack onto that the other major suppressor, which is pregnancy itself. Ancient women, across most hunter-gatherer and early agricultural populations, spent the majority of their reproductive years either pregnant or breastfeeding, often in overlapping back-to-back cycles. A woman might get pregnant, breastfeed for 2, 3, sometimes 4 years, with fertility naturally suppressed the entire time because of nursing frequency, and then get pregnant again shortly after weaning. The gaps where menstruation actually returned were narrow, sometimes only a handful of cycles between pregnancies, sometimes none at all before the next pregnancy began. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because this reframes something people assume is a fixed, unchanging biological constant. Modern women are not menstruating more because something is wrong with modern bodies. Modern women are menstruating more because modern life removed almost every single one of the natural suppressors that used to be constantly active. Fewer pregnancies across a lifetime, shorter breastfeeding windows, often replaced partially or entirely by formula, earlier onset of puberty due to better nutrition and higher body fat percentages, later average age of first pregnancy. Every one of those factors independently increases lifetime menstrual cycles. Stack them together, and you get the 450 numbers researchers now consider typical for a contemporary woman in an industrialized country. Your body isn't malfunctioning. Your body is doing exactly what it's designed to do in an environment that removed the natural breaks that used to be there almost constantly. So now, the real question. What did ancient women actually do physically in the moments when menstruation did happen? Because it did happen, just less often. And this is where the archaeological and anthropological record gets genuinely interesting, because the honest answer involves considerably more resourcefulness than most people assume, and a level of material knowledge that gets almost zero credit in popular history. Cross-cultural anthropological surveys of traditional societies, going back through ethnographic records collected across multiple continents, document an enormous range of menstrual materials. Softened moss, used specifically for its natural absorbency, appears repeatedly across northern and Arctic populations. Grass, shredded bark fiber, and soft plant down show up across African and South American accounts. Animal hide, cleaned and softened through repeated working, appears in colder climates where plant material was scarce for parts of the year. In some documented cultures, women used a folded, reusable cloth, essentially a precursor to a modern cloth pad, washed and reused cycle after cycle. This wasn't improvisation happening in a panic. This was accumulated, transmitted, generational knowledge. Mothers taught daughters. Older women in a group taught younger ones. Material knowledge about which moss held the most liquid without falling apart, which bark fiber stayed soft against skin, which plants had mild antibacterial properties. That knowledge moved the same way tool-making knowledge moved, passed down deliberately because getting it wrong had real consequences. And this is worth sitting with for a second, because it directly dismantles a lazy assumption people carry into ancient history. The assumption that a woman on her period 12,000 years ago was simply suffering, simply enduring, simply making do with nothing. The actual picture is closer to the opposite. These were women operating with functional, tested, culturally transmitted solutions specific to their environment. Not primitive improvisation, applied biological knowledge, refined over generations, adapted to whatever material the local ecosystem provided. There's also a social layer to this that deserves real attention, because menstruation in many documented traditional societies wasn't hidden the way it is in most modern industrialized cultures. It was, in a lot of cases, deeply communal. Menstrual huts, separate structures where women gathered during their cycles, appear across an enormous range of unrelated cultures worldwide, from parts of Nepal to certain Native American communities to regions of sub-Saharan Africa. Modern retellings tend to frame these spaces primarily through a lens of exclusion or taboo, and in some documented cases that framing is accurate. But researchers studying these practices more closely have found something more layered. In several documented cultures, menstrual huts functioned simultaneously as rest spaces, as social gathering points where women shared knowledge, told stories, and supported each other through physical discomfort away from daily labor obligations. The taboo and the community existed side by side, tangled together, not a simple story of oppression or a simple story of sisterhood, but something messier and more human than either narrative alone. Nutrition mattered here too, in a way that connects directly back to that opening statistic. Because caloric scarcity, the kind of chronic, seasonal food insecurity that defined most of prehistoric human existence, doesn't just get suppressed by breastfeeding, it independently suppresses reproductive function on its own. A body running a consistent caloric deficit will often reduce or halt menstruation entirely as a direct survival mechanism. Because pregnancy under conditions of genuine starvation risk is often fatal for both mother and child. This is not a hypothetical. Modern clinical data on women experiencing extreme caloric restriction, whether through famine, intense athletic training, or disordered eating, consistently shows the same pattern. The body triages. Reproduction gets deprioritized the moment survival margins get thin. Ancient women living through lean seasons, through winters, through periods of genuine food scarcity that modern life simply doesn't replicate, were almost certainly experiencing exactly this kind of natural cyclical suppression on top of the breastfeeding and pregnancy effects already discussed. Put all three mechanisms together, near-constant breastfeeding suppression, back-to-back pregnancies, and periodic nutritional suppression during lean seasons, and the 50-cycle lifetime estimate stops sounding surprising and starts sounding almost inevitable. It's not that ancient women had some special resilience modern women lack. It's that modern life, for all its advantages, quietly removed nearly every natural mechanism that used to keep that number low.
And here's the part that should make you sit with this a little longer than you expected to. This shift isn't ancient history, it's recent. It's essentially happening within the last 100 years, accelerating specifically alongside industrialization, formula feeding, and declining average family size. Researchers studying this shift describe it using a term that sounds almost clinical for something this significant: incessant ovulation. The idea that the modern female body, cycling nearly every month for decades with minimal interruption, is functioning in a way that has almost no precedent across the deep evolutionary history of the species. Some researchers have connected this directly to rising rates of certain reproductive cancers in modern populations, hypothesizing that hundreds of additional uninterrupted cycles across a lifetime represent hundreds of additional rounds of cellular activity in reproductive tissue that ancestral bodies simply never experienced at that frequency. That's still an active area of research, still being studied, still debated in its exact mechanisms, but the underlying pattern that your body is running a process at a frequency evolution never calibrated it for is not seriously disputed. So the next time this comes up, and it will, because periods are one of those things everyone has an opinion about and almost nobody has the actual data for, here's what you now know that most people don't. Ancient women weren't just enduring, they were solving a real, recurring physical problem with real, tested, transmitted solutions, using whatever their environment gave them. But they were also, without knowing it, living inside a completely different hormonal reality than you are. Fewer cycles, more suppression, a body constantly buffered by pregnancy, by nursing, by seasonal scarcity, in ways your body almost never gets to experience. You're not broken. You're not unusually burdened. You're just the first version of this body in the entire evolutionary history of this species to actually go through it 450 times.